The 22nd to the 23rd, the weather has been very bad. The Emperor suffering greatly from the toothache and having a swelled cheek, had not been able to go out for the last 2 days. I have spent the greatest part of them with him in his apartment or in his drawing room, which he has converted into a promenade by opening the doors of communication from one to the other. Amongst the various subjects of our conversation, he once told me certain things which he had heard, at which I much rejoiced. Nothing can give a more striking proof of the horrors of our situation than the importance which I attached to them. But everything is in proportion to the situation in which we are placed. At another time, the Emperor expressed his regret at being so lazy with respect to the English language. I told him that he now knew as much of it as he wanted. He could read all books. It was now only necessary to reduce the whole to a regular system, but were the rule and compass fit things for him? After going through several subjects of conversation, the Emperor spoke of Baron Larry, on whom he passed the highest encomium, saying that Larry had left the impression on his mind of a true honest man, that to science he united in the highest degree the virtue of active philanthropy. He looked upon the wounded as belonging to his family. Every consideration gave way before the care which he bestowed upon the hospitals. In our first campaigns under the Republic, which have been so much recited, said the Emperor, a most fortunate revolution took place in the surgical department, which has since spread to all the armies of Europe, and to Larry it is in great measure that mankind is indebted for it. The surgeon now shares the dangers of the soldier. It is in the midst of the fire that he devotes his care to him. Larry possesses all my esteem and my gratitude. This favorable impression seems clearly to have occupied Napoleon's mind in his last moments, for he has left Larry a mark of his remembrance with this honorable testimony, the most virtuous man that I have known. On reading these words, I concluded that some peculiar circumstance must have produced this most magnificent expression of esteem, and the following is the result of my inquiries. After the battles of Lutzenwürgen and Bautzen, the victorious Napoleon sent for the surgeon Larry to ascertain, as usual, the number of the wounded and the state in which they were. They happened to be on this occasion very considerably more numerous than at other times and in other engagements. The Emperor was surprised at this circumstance and endeavored to explain the cause of it. Monsieur Larry thought that independently of local causes, it might be found in the great number of soldiers who had fought on that day for the first time, and who were on that account more awkward in their movements and less expert in avoiding danger. The Emperor, whose mind was extremely preoccupied by this affair, was not satisfied with this explanation and made inquiries elsewhere. As there were at that moment several persons who were heartily tired of war, who would have wished for peace on any conditions, and who would not have been sorry to see the Emperor compelled to make it, whether from the effect of calculation or conviction. The Emperor was told, in answer to his inquiries, that the immense number of wounded ought not to be a matter of surprise, that the greatest proportion of them were wounded in the hand, and they had inflicted the wound on themselves in order to be disabled from fighting. The Emperor was thunderstruck at this information. He repeated his inquiries and found them attended with the same result. He was in a state of despair. If it be thus, he exclaimed, notwithstanding our success, our situation is hopeless. France will be delivered up defenseless to the barbarians. And turning over in his mind by what means he should put a stop to this contagion, he ordered all the wounded of a certain description to be put on one side, and named a commission composed of surgeons with Larry at their head to examine their wounds, resolved to punish most severely those who should be found to have been so cowardly as to mutilate themselves. Monsieur Larry, still unwilling to believe in this voluntary self-mutilation, which, in his opinion, was a stain on the honor of the army and of the nation, appeared before the Emperor to state his opinion once more to him. But Napoleon, incensed at his obstinacy, which some persons had taken care to magnify in his eyes, said to him with severity, Sir, you will make your observations to me officially. Go and fulfill your duty. Baron Larry immediately applied to the business, but in a solemn manner. He followed up the most trifling details and therefore proceeded slowly, whilst various motives rendered many persons impatient to see the issue, and it was known that the emperor himself was no less impatient. Some persons did not fail to point out to Monsieur Larry the delicate situation in which he was placed, but he turned a deaf ear to all observations and remained unmoved. At last, after some days, he went to the emperor, insisting upon being allowed to deliver his report himself. "Well, sir," said the emperor, "do you still persist in your opinion?" "More than that, sire. I am come to prove to your majesty that I was right. These brave young men were basely calumniated. I have spent a considerable time in the strictest investigation, and I have not found one single man guilty. There is a deposition in writing on the individual case of every one of those wounded men, bales of them to be examined." The emperor looked at him with a gloomy expression, and taking his report with a kind of emotion, he said, "Very well, sir, I will look into it." And he paced the room with a rapid stride, with an air of agitation and indecision. At last, coming up to Larry with an open countenance, he shook him cordially by the hand and said with emotion, "Farewell, Monsieur Larry. A sovereign is truly fortunate to have to do with such men as you are. You will receive my orders." Monsieur Larry received the same evening from Napoleon his picture set in diamonds, 6,000 francs in gold, and a pension on the state of 3,000 francs, independent, it was said, of every other reward to which he might be entitled by his rank, his seniority, and his future services. Such traits are invaluable for history, as they exhibit on the one hand an honest man who does not hesitate to defend truth against a sovereign prepossessed and incensed, and because they display on the other the noble mind of the sovereign in the happiness and the gratitude which he expressed on being undeceived. The 24th, the emperor has not been out. He has not sent for any of us, and he has not appeared at dinner. This made us fear that he was ill. After 10 o'clock, he sent for me, and I was not yet in bed. He told me that he had not left his sofa the whole day. He had read during nearly 18 hours. He had only taken a little soup. He was suffering from his teeth. I told him we had feared it was something more serious, for that our grief at not seeing him was always increased by apprehension. After a short time, he began to touch upon our pecuniary resources. He had, as he humorously expressed it, held his council in the morning. The plate had been weighed, and the quantity that was to be sold had been computed. The produce of it, he added, would enable us to go on for some time longer. I again renewed the offer of the 4,000 louis which I had in the English funds, and he deigned to accept them. "Mine is a singular situation," said he. "I have no doubt that if a communication were allowed with me, and that my relatives, or even many strangers, could suspect that I am in want, I should soon be amply provided with everything that I require. But ought I to be a burden to my friends and expose them to the undue advantage which the English ministers might take of their goodwill? I have applied to those ministers for a few books, and they have sent them to me with all the inattention and neglect of a careless agent. They claim from me 1,500 or 2,000 pounds sterling. That is about 50,000 francs, for what I might certainly have procured for less than 12,000. Would it not be the same with everyone else? If I accept what you offer, it must be strictly applied to our immediate wants. For after all, we must live, and we really cannot live upon what they give us. The small addition of 100 louis per month would just be sufficient, and that is the sum which you must ask for, and appropriate as carefully as possible." The calash then came up to us. It was driven 4 in hand by Archambault. This could not be otherwise, since the departure of Archambault's brother. The emperor refused at first to get into the carriage. He did not think it prudent in the midst of the stumps of trees with which we were surrounded. He remembered his famous fall at St. Cloud, and wished one of the English servants to ride as a postilion, but Archambault protested that he should feel less secure in that manner than in driving alone. Since the departure of his brother, he said he had been constantly practicing amongst the trees in order to be sure that he could answer for himself. The emperor then got in the calash, and we took 2 turns. On our return, he went to see the residence of the Grand Marshal, with which he was not yet acquainted. The evening was terminated by reading some passages of Langepierre's tragedy of Medea, which the emperor interrupted to compare it with that of Euripides on the same subject, which he ordered to be brought to him. He mentioned on this subject that he had formerly ordered one of the Greek tragedies to be represented at his theater in the palace in all its integrity, choosing the best possible translation and imitating as closely as possible the manners, dresses, forms, and scenery of the original. He could not recollect what circumstance or what obstacle had prevented the execution of the plan. Having retired to his apartment and not finding himself disposed to sleep, he took some turns in his room and threw himself on his sofa. He opened a kind of political almanac, which happened to be at hand, and fell upon a list of our marshals, which he passed in review, adding at the same time quotations and anecdotes already known or related. When he came to Marshal Jourdan, he dwelt for some time on the subject and concluded by saying, "This is one who has been assuredly very ill treated by me. It was therefore natural to conclude that he would be highly incensed against me. But I have heard with pleasure that he has behaved with great moderation since my fall. He has given an example of that elevation of mind which serves to distinguish men and does honor to their character. However, he was a true patriot, and that explains many things." The usual summary cannot henceforth be long. Strictly speaking, 3 sentences would suffice to trace it. Incessant annoyance, absolute seclusion, infallible destruction. The remainder of Napoleon's existence will only be a cruel and prolonged agony. It has already been seen that the arrival of a new governor became for us a signal of the commencement of a life of misery. A few days had sufficed to unfold his disposition, and soon afterwards the annoyances and insults of which he made himself the organ, or which he himself created, were carried to the highest pitch. He rendered us an object of terror to the inhabitants. He subjected us to the most cruel vexations. He forbade us to write without a previous communication with him, even to those persons with whom he did not prevent us from conversing without restraint. He invited General Bonaparte to dinner at his table to show him to a lady of rank who was for a short time on the island. He arrested one of our servants. He now produces a dispatch in pursuance of which he endeavors to oblige the emperor to go into the meanest details of his wants, as Napoleon expressed it, and to discuss them with him. He importunes the emperor to give money, which he does not possess, and by dint of reductions in the common necessaries of life obliges him to break up and sell his plate, determining at the same time, by his authority as governor, the rate at which it is to be sold, and the person who is to purchase it. He ridiculously restricts us to 1 bottle of wine per head, including the emperor. He cheapens our existence, said the emperor. He grudges me the air I breathe, and what he sends to us for our subsistence is sometimes, nay, frequently so bad that we are obliged to apply for provisions to the neighboring camp. He lays a snare for Napoleon and exults in the hope of being able to impart to him personally and pompously a communication which he calls a ministerial order, but which is so outrageous that he refuses to leave a copy of it. He prescribes to the emperor the most absurd regulations. He capriciously and with bitter irony contracts the space of his usual limits, chalks out the trace of his footsteps, and even goes so far as to attempt to regulate the nature of his conversations and the tenor of his expressions. He surrounds us with trenches, palisados, and redoubts. He obliges each of us individually in order to be allowed to remain with the emperor, to sign a declaration that we submit to all these restrictions. He makes use of us as instruments to degrade the emperor by obliging us to call him Bonaparte. under pain of being immediately removed from his person and instantly sent out of the island. The emperor, provoked by such disgraceful usage and such gratuitous insults, opens his mind without reserve to Sir Hudson Lowe. His words know no restraint. He frees himself forever from his odious presence and declares that he never will see him again. The most unworthy proceeding of the English ministers, said the emperor to him, is not to have sent me here, but to have delivered me into your hands. I complained to the admiral, your predecessor, but he at least had a heart. You are a disgrace to your nation, and your name will forever be a stain upon its character. This governor, the emperor would frequently say to us, has nothing of an Englishman in his composition. He is nothing but a worthless shire of Sicily. I at first complained that a jailer had been sent to me, but now I affirm they have sent me an executioner. I have recorded these expressions, and I might mention many more, however harsh they may be. First, because I heard them uttered. Secondly, because Napoleon used them in speaking to Sir Hudson Lowe in person or caused them to be repeated to him. Thirdly, and lastly, because they were deserved on account of the arbitrary, oppressive, and brutal manner in which the governor, to the great scandal of the Englishmen themselves, who were on the spot and who then manifested their disgust at his conduct, abused the power with which he was invested in the name of a nation so eminently distinguished all over the globe, of a prince so universally respected in Europe, and of a cabinet in which there were still some honorable characters, men personally known by their moderation and their elegant manners. The vexations by which Napoleon was assailed were incessant. They pursued him at every moment of his existence. Not a day passed without the infliction of a fresh wound. And one of the torments recorded in fabulous history may be said to have been thus realized. If during that period of affliction for so many generous hearts, the genius of Europe, the genius of truth, and the genius of history have ever unwillingly turned their eyes towards St. Helena and upon the great Napoleon, if they have sought for him in that island which they thought it would be endeavored at least to turn into a kind of Elysium for him, what must have been their indignation to see him in the bright glory of so many immortal actions, chained like Prometheus to a rock, and like him under the claws of a vulture, which delights in tearing him to pieces. Oh, infamy! Oh, eternal disgrace! During this period, the emperor's health has been constantly and considerably declining. His body, which was thought so robust, which had endured so many toils and withstood so much fatigue, supported by victory and glory, was now bending under the weight of infirmities prematurely brought on by the injustice of men. Almost every day he is attacked by some new indisposition: fever, swelled face, symptoms of scurvy, constant colds. His features are altered, his gait becomes heavy, his legs swelled. Our hearts were torn in seeing him thus hastening towards infallible destruction. All our cares are in vain.